So my guest this morning is an associate professor and the head of the Department of Communication Science at the University of the Free State in Bloemfontein in South Africa. His new book, Apartheid Studies, a Manifesto, was published by Africa World Press, and a copy of it can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste right in the description panel on the upload for this video. Professor Mboti, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you, Anotida, for having me.
Wonderful. That is perfect. I was looking forward to having you. The work is really changing how we think about issues of enslavement, colonialism, impoverishment, and exploitation. I had the opportunity to see a post of a public lecture that you gave at the University of California, Santa Barbara, following an invitation by Professor Moses Chukwuero. I was also looking forward to have you to give a talk on this show. So without wasting much time, I would want to get into the first questions that I have for you about the book. Your book proposes the establishment of an interdisciplinary field of study you call Apartheid Studies. What is the thinking, or what is the logic behind this idea?
There are a number of things that got me on this road. And I'll mention just a couple of them, and in no order of importance. There's a scholar that many of you might know in the humanities, in history. His name is Thomas Piketty. And so is this French economic historian or economist, but he has written about the economics of inequality. So he's two really big books, The Economics of Inequality and also Capital in the 21st Century. So Piketty, in 2015, he came to South Africa to much fanfare, to much pomp and fanfare. And he also returned actually in 2021 to much less fanfare. But what fascinated me about this man and his work is that he had been invited in 2015 by the University of Johannesburg to come to South Africa and expound on inequality. What is inequality? What to do about it? Inequality in South Africa. I mean, and as you would know, Anotida, South Africa is the most unequal society on earth, according at least to certain measures and indices. And in other words, people live with inequality. They wake up every day, the sun rises in the east and it sets in the west, and they live with inequality, they live with harm. And they've lived with inequality for more than 100 years, for hundreds of years. So someone comes from France and lectures South Africans on what inequality is, which for me is absurd. I'm not saying we shouldn't have an exchange of knowledge from the global north to the global south, but I do think that people here know a lot more about the quotidian aspect of inequality, about actually what inequality is as a lived element, not just something that you theorize about. And in fact, you should be getting people from the global south flying to France to tell them about inequality.
That's true.
Of course, there's inequality everywhere. But the idea of paying someone to come from France, a country which is a former colonizer anyway, and is a contributor to the inequality that you see in Africa. And then that person comes and then he says, okay, this is inequality, this is how you deal with it. For me, it's frankly absurd. What I'm doing by mentioning this Thomas Piketty example is the absence in the theorizing of our own realities in Africa, in South Africa, and so on. So someone comes from elsewhere and he or she tells us how we live and what we are living and why we are living like that. And of course, it's okay for people to do that, but I do think that we can be stronger and more authentic theorists on these issues. So this is just continuing traditions of colonial anthropology, where people just come to study Africans, and the Africans themselves do not study the anthropologists, but also do not study themselves. So this example for me shows you how, and inequality is a central element of apartheid, for instance. And this tells you why there is a disjuncture between the exchange of knowledge or the global flows of knowledge. And Apartheid Studies, part of its motivation is to shift this unequal exchange in the global flow of knowledge. You can't have Thomas Piketty coming to South Africa to lecture about inequality. Is frankly absurd. A second motivation that I'll give for having started on this path, on this journey of Apartheid Studies, is the events of 2012, specifically 17 August 2012. So people know about the Lone Min massacre, what some people call the Marikana massacre. But I don't call it the Marikana massacre, I call it the Lone Min massacre, because I need to situate capital at the heart of it, because Lone Min is London Minerals. And London Minerals is linked to London Rhodesia, it's linked to colonial capital, and so on and so forth. So when you call it Marikana massacre, it's like you are removing the central element of capital in causing that particular massacre that happened in 2012. So I don't know who call it Marikana massacre. You put a geographical marker there. So I call it the Lone Min massacre. But on 16 August 2012, 34 miners were murdered in cold blood by the police in South Africa after a mining strike in the Platinum Belt. 17 of them were murdered before the video cameras. So as I was watching these videos, I was staying in Durban at the time. I was a postdoctoral scholar at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. I was shocked by the violence and the bloodshed. And so I thought, surely the world has to stop for us to sort this out. This cannot happen. So I expected the next day, the 17th of August, 2012, to be a special day where the country would grind to a halt so that we deal with this seminal moment. So 17 August 2012 is seminal for Apartheid Studies because I woke up and everything was normal. The sun rose in the east and set in the west. The birds were chirping in the trees. I went to the bus rank. Passengers were being picked up. Parents were picking children, dropping them off at school. The school ran. Ladies were well dressed. And I was like, but so how is this possible? How is it possible that something has just happened that is as horrific as this has happened, but actually life is going on? So I became fascinated by the aftermath, right? About the day after, you could call it the morning after. So the 17th of August is more important to Apartheid Studies, not the 16th itself, which is really key, but the life,
afterwards.
The 20th of August. Yes, so it's like taking 12 September. So people like to talk of 9/11 in America. I'm not too interested in 9/11. I'm more interested in 9/12 day, because this is where now the ordinary man is living with this new reality. So this is where apartheid comes from. My interest in 17 August 2012, in 12 September 2001. Like how is it people can live with this? And there in that question is the answer to the key question of Apartheid Studies, which is, how does oppression persist? How does apartheid persist? How did people live with apartheid? Because people actually lived with apartheid, right? So you think apartheid was evil and horrific and harmful. Yes, it was. But it did not kill the majority of our people. Most of them actually lived through it. They survived through it. So I'm fascinated by this question of, how do people live with harm? How do people live in harm's way? So this was also a motivation that I had, Anotida, about how do people live with harm? How does harm persist? And then, of course, another motivation was, Nelson Mandela, 10 May 1994, he says, never, never, and never again to apartheid at the union buildings. And my question was, how do you say never again to something that you do not study? Right? There's not a single module or course at any university in South Africa that is teaching apartheid specifically, that is called Apartheid Studies. There is no center or research chair or institute or unit, nothing, right? Absolutely nothing. If you go to other countries, for instance, where the Holocaust was seminal, they do teach the Holocaust.
Yes.
They do teach modules in Italy, in the US, and so on and so forth, fascism and Holocaust. but you cannot forget your history. They even put these things in their constitutions, right? They mention these things in their constitutions. China's constitution mentions what they call the 100 years of humiliation.
Yeah.
The Japanese constitution, Article 9, I think it is, it mentions, engage in war and building a military and so on. I could go on and on. The Italian constitution, even the Zimbabwean constitution talks about the liberation struggle.
Yes,
the South African constitution is silent on apartheid. They do not mention it, not even once. It's not there. It's not there in the preamble. They just talk about injustices of the past. But then what are injustices of the past? Where does the past begin? Where does it end? Does the past begin with Shaka Zulu? Does it begin in 1652, in 1510? They don't say. So they just say injustices of the past, but they do not mention apartheid. So there's an absence there. There's a loophole there that we need to reflect on. So this was another motivation for me to say, look, there's a gap here. There's a gap that needs to be spoken about. And then maybe let me give a last motivation. I had many, but I'll just give the last motivation. I was supervising a master's student at the University of Johannesburg, and he eventually passed and he got a distinction. But when he was doing this master's degree was on is violence a form of communication? So this student was studying service delivery protests, what are called service delivery protests in South Africa, wanting to find out, is there a communicative element behind those protests? Are the protesters trying to communicate somehow? And so, when he was looking at violence as a form of communication in an informal settlement called Tembelihle, we go to the theoretical framework, which was the third chapter, and we started looking now for theories of power and violence. We started looking for organic theories of violence from South Africa. And South Africa is a country which has lived for more than 370 years with colonial violence. But we couldn't find even a single South African theory of violence. And this was absurd, because you have got this whole archive over hundreds of years, but we don't have an organic theory of violence from here. We ended up, Anotida, using Michel Foucault, who theorizes power and violence, in the French clinic, hospital, asylum, in 18th and 19th century Europe. We ended up using Antonio Gramsci, who theorizes violence in the context of Mussolini's fascism in Italy. We ended up theorizing violence from the context of Slavoj Žižek, who theorizes violence in the context of Soviet Union history and politics. So look at how these are important ways of theorizing violence. So I'm not saying we shouldn't use Foucault, Gramsci, or Zizek, but how is it that in South Africa, where we have even longer genealogy of violence, where we've got the archive of violence surrounding us, we don't have a theorization of violence? So I said, look, no, we need to remedy this absence. So my work in apartheid is part of trying to remedy all these gaps and silences.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. I like that you point to the fact that apartheid is not being studied, which brings to light the idea of the coloniality of knowledge production within the whole field of African studies itself, that probably our people suffer from this syndrome that we can only wait until a research is done from the global north or by a scholar from the global north researching about the global south, such that we can be able to start to engage with it. But I like the idea that you bring, that it's important for us people from the global south to study our own problems, to study our own concepts, and to theorize our own problems. So now the next question that I have for you, you also point out in this book that apartheid is the highest stage of oppression. And you say it functions by allocating differential rates of oppression to human beings. What is the meaning of this term, and why is it fundamental in understanding the persistence of apartheid?
So thank you, Anotida, for that really important question, which is actually in two parts. My definition of apartheid is the highest stage of oppression, and secondly, the notion of the rate of oppression or rates of oppression. So number one, why do I call apartheid the the highest stage of oppression. So there's a model that I develop in my book. I'm not going to go too deeply into that model because of time, but also I think readers, when they buy the book, they'll be able to have a look at that particular model themselves. And in that model, I show that apartheid goes through metamorphosis. It doesn't end, but what it does is it goes through sort of like these phases of sublimation, where the way it oppresses people gets actually quote unquote better and better and better. In other words, apartheid, when it starts, I call it pre-primitive apartheid, where you need state violence. I think this is what our Teza would call repressive state apparatus, maybe. But essentially, you need courts, you need prisons, you need all these visible forms of violence, essentially to dominate a people. So if you remember when the colonizers first came to Africa, they basically had to brutally put down local resistances. But the issue with local resistances like that is that they are costly for the colonizer. So the colonizer actually doesn't like to continue to do that time and time and time again. So the cost of oppression is something that the colonizer does not like. If you read the history of the British Colonial Office, they didn't like to pay for excursions in Nigeria and elsewhere in South Africa. They wanted the money to be made in the colony, and they wanted the colony to pay for itself. Essentially, they wanted the colonized to foot their own bill, the bill of their own oppression. Right?
Yes.
So this is where the whole idea of if you want indirect rule comes from. The formulation of indirect rule by Lugard, by Goldie, in Nigeria, in West Africa, the formulation of indirect rule by Shepstone in South Africa is partly to defray the expenses of oppression, to defray the expenses of colonization by actually drawing the expenditure from the colony itself and paying for oppression from the colony itself, because they didn't want to pay from the metropole. And we see how India was looted, for instance. They basically that's exactly the model that they want. They want the colony to pay for its own oppression, but also to be looted. So now when you get colonialism becoming more expensive, this is a sign of what I call pre-primitive apartheid because of the cost. The cost needs to cut down. It needs to be a cost-cutting. There needs to be a cost-cutting element to colonization. So colonialism starts to improve the way it functions. And I use improve in quotes, of course, by delegating a lot of the functions to the oppressed themselves. So if you look at any general colonizing army, there wouldn't be many whites in that army. Maybe the officers would be white, but most of them would actually be Africans themselves. If you look at the people who defeated Lobengula and he crossed the Shangani and then he died, he was exiled from Bulawayo. The ratio of Africans to British was 6-9. There were more Africans than the British there. In other words, there were many Shona there who were going after Lobengula. So in every case of colonization, it's rare to find the colonizer outnumbering the locals. So there's a numeric there that is very interesting, because you find out that the raw material for colonizing, you find it there in the colony. You don't bring it from Britain. You don't bring it from France. And the most important, quote unquote, raw material, of course, is the human resource. And you always find, the colonial army in the colonies themselves, but you also find that, colonial administration was done through native administrators, through chiefs, and so on and so forth. So you're basically utilizing the raw materials that are already in place so that you don't have to bring a lot from the metropole. But the point I'm trying to make is that after this phase of, if you want, founding colonialism, founding imperialism, and so on and so forth, you start to have, in South Africa, for instance, you start to have the mining industry, you start to have agriculture, and later on manufacturing and factories. So you need labor for that. And you can't start relying on the same methods that you used earlier in the phase that I call pre-primitive apartheid, you start to have what you call primitive apartheid. And primitive apartheid is what everyone in the world understands as apartheid. What we call apartheid today, what we say started in 1948 and ended in 1994, I call it primitive apartheid. And it is dependent on the dompas. It is dependent on influx laws. Africans have to live in segregated townships. Africans have to live in hostels, have to live in dormitories. The all-male hostels. Africans have to live far away in so-called independent states, the Bantustans and so forth. So influx control was at the center of primitive apartheid, but you have to have a physical dompas that you carried around with you, to show whether you belong or not, whether you could be in an area for 72 hours and so on and so forth. And so the influx control is a key tenet and central element of primitive apartheid. So now when apartheid becomes what I call undetectable, which is the highest stage now of apartheid, or the highest stage of oppression, is actually a stage which is where we are at right now. Of course, this stage could overlap with the other stages. So these stages are not exclusive. You can actually have overlapping of pre-primitive apartheid, primitive apartheid, and actual apartheid itself, which is where we are actually living today in 2022 and beyond, where I argue that the colonizer actually goes on holiday, right? So I say that the high stage of oppression is where the colonizer does not need to be there, and yet the functions of colonialism continue as if the colonizer is there. So think about a slave master or a plantation owner who is not at a plantation, and yet the plantation is still running as if he was there. Now it means you go to Soweto, where you once refused to go because you were removed to go there from Sophia Town. Now you are dumped there. You were dumped there in 1960, 1950, and so on. Fast forward to 2022, and people call Soweto home. So they were removed there. They didn't want to go there 50 years ago. They even had a slogan that, we won't go, we won't move. 22 years later, there's a culture there, there's a whole identity there, and people call it home. In fact, people wake up every morning, they get on the bus, they go to the city, and at 5, they come back home. And that element of forcing them to go to Soweto is gone now. Soweto, in fact, has become identified with, that's how Africans live. And suddenly, you no longer need police with buttons, you no longer need the dompas. People actually go to these places by themselves, using their own reflexes. It means the colonizer can now go on holiday, he can now go on sabbatical. So that is, for me, the high stage of oppression, where oppression does not have to foot much of the bill of oppression, but in fact, that bill is totally seen to by the oppressed themselves. So this is what I call the high stage of oppression. And if you then look at the rate of oppression, basically, it asks, why does oppression persist for so long? Why is it we have lived under inequality for longer than we have lived under freedom and justice? So just look at any history of any country around the world, but we've lived under oppression for far longer than we've lived without it. So the biggest sample size we have, Anotida, is that we've actually lived with inequality for longer than we've lived with equality. So, and yet life goes on. And yet skyscrapers are built, money is invested, billionaires are made, new inventions are made. So it's not incompatible, right? You can have inequality and you can have development at the same time. These things have a good neighborliness, they can coexist together. This is something that I'm puzzled by, but also fascinated by. But the rate of oppression comes from when you consider this persistence and ask, how does oppression persist? And you find out that it is because people actually never experience the same oppression in the same way. Yes, it's the same oppression, but we don't experience it in the same way. Marxists want to talk about class and so on and so forth, but I think it's deeper than just class. It's way deeper than that. So the key question to ask about the rate of oppression is, where were you when X happened? Where were you when X happened, right? So ask South Africans. Yes, there was a struggle against apartheid. Yes, most people hated apartheid, but where were they, for instance, on 22 September 1977? Right? This is the date when Steve Biko was murdered in the cells in Pretoria. You will find out that they were in different places. Some were at work, some were at weddings, others were at football matches, others were sick in hospital. but they're all doing different things, right? The point I'm trying to make is, while Biko was being brutalized, other people were also doing other things. It does not mean that the oppressed were not oppressed. It just means that at that time, they were doing other things. And so it's not as if every African was focused at the Pretoria prison where Biko was being killed. No, other Africans were getting on with their lives. And getting on with your life does not mean you don't want to struggle. It does not mean that you're not part of the struggle. It simply means that oppression compartmentalizes us in such a way that when I'm now being brutalized, you, Anotida, you're taking your son to boarding school. So even if I say, Anotida, come, let's march, because this has to go, you find out that Anotida will be like, okay, after I come back from dropping off my children, then I can join you. But by the time you come back to join us, I've moved on. My mother is sick and I have to attend her in hospital. So what it means is you never get everyone getting angry at the same time. So solidarity becomes impossible because, when you have to work, you can't ask me to stop work to come to your march. I understand that you have to march against, police brutality in America, right? Black Lives Matter. But not every Black person is at the Black Lives Matter protest, right? It's only a small minority. But does it mean that people don't care about those issues? Does it mean that people are not living under police oppression? No, they are. But look at where they are when the Black Lives Matter protests are happening. It shows you that, we all have different rates of oppression, right? Every oppressed person experiences the same sort of oppression differently. And when that difference is applied, you start to see that we never respond to oppression in a uniform way. And therefore, it is because of the rate of oppression that oppression actually persists. Because we actually never focus on dismantling oppression at the same time, in the same way, the same rate. We're always doing it differently. So by the time, I get angry, Anotida is now, is now about to get that plum job at this IT company that he has always wanted to work at. And so, for me to go and tell Anotida to say, come, join me in the fight. It's like, dude, I've been working for this job for the last 15 years. I'm just about to get that job. And you want me now to go to a protest about this. It does not mean that you don't care. It does not mean that you don't realize how important it is. But look at how oppression puts you. It gives you a different rate of oppression to me. And that different rate of oppression, it actually adjusts how bothered you are by a particular event or element. And therefore, what it means is, you never see the oppressed all thinking about oppression in the same way, feeling oppression in the same way. It does not mean that there is no oppression. It actually just means that we all have different rates of oppression. This is why Black people who have a degree will experience oppression differently. Black people who work in the mines, who are zamazamas, and so on. Black people who can read and write. The same Africans, who live in the same neighborhood. Some have a car, some have never had a car, some have a television, some have a fridge, some have never had a fridge. Some live in the suburbs, others live in the townships. And so all of these are Africans, all of these are oppressed people, but already their rate of oppression is different. So some people will tell you, okay, I sympathize with what has happened to the Lone Min miners who are massacred on 16 August 2012. But then they say, look, it's just too bad. But I have to pick up my kids in, at school, right? So they just say, it's too bad. But then when that person's child is now involved, let's say that person's child is the one that was involved. Suddenly now it changes. Solidarity. Now it changes. Now they are more involved. Now their rate of oppression is directly confronted with this situation. But suddenly the others are also doing other things. Now this one is starting a new farming project, and surely just because your child was shot by the police, they are not going to be there. So this explains the numbers of Black people in Black Lives Matter protests. This explains what Black people were doing on 22 September 1977. It explains what the numbers of Black people in service delivery protests, in anything that makes, whether it's a strike, whether it's a march for better wages. Some people are blocking the road to strike for better wages. Others are annoyed. They want to get to work. Why are these idiots blocking the road? I need to get to work. I'm late for my interview. I sympathize with them, but they mustn't block the road. I need to get to my workplace. So you already see the divisions and the difference is in the rates of oppression of someone who wants to get to work and someone who's blocking the road because they need better wages or they need service delivered in their community. So that's how I explain differences in rates of oppression in my work, to say we never experience oppression in the same way. And this complicates how we resist oppression and how we react to oppression. And because our rates of oppression are always different, oppression can actually persist. And it can persist in a way where the oppressor does not need to be there physically. The oppressor can go to the Bahamas for a holiday, and they know that the rates of oppression are going to take care of everything. Because there's no way you are all going to sit down and say, we feel it the same way. So let's all dismantle the system. No, some people are going to say, yeah, so, too bad. But I have to go to Zimbabwe because my mother is sick. And you can't tell someone to say, don't go, because we have to fight this. Because your rates of oppression are different. The moment you now stop me going to Zimbabwe to check on my sick mother, you're already oppressing me. So that's how complicated the rate of oppression is. But for me, I think it is an important explanation of how and why oppression persists.
Goes beyond to include issues about even political participation in elections. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine from Malawi, and we were talking about the reasons why probably some people don't participate in politics by means of voting, attending rallies, or just becoming educated politically about government functionality, constitutional laws and policies that government is pursuing. But we got to the conclusion that to some degree our people, or to a greater extent, our people are too poor sometimes to invest their attention into national issues.
They have a different rate of oppression.
That is the point, and enable them to invest their attentions into issues of government. But now let's move to the last question that I have for you. That has to do with what you propose. You propose that ideally, every university in South Africa should offer a compulsory module on apartheid studies to students in all disciplines. Why is it important at this point in time? And in what ways would it benefit learners?
This is important, not only because, look, pedagogy is important, education is important, but also because of the absence that I mentioned at the beginning of the interview, where you right now you have a lot of people in South Africa questioning whether the Rainbow Nation project has failed. You have instances of racism. You have, of course, the world's highest inequality. You've got more than 65% of Black people living in poverty in South Africa. You've got unemployment over 40%, right? And people are looking for answers in terms of what is behind this, what is causing this. And because we live in so-called post-apartheid South Africa, apartheid has been removed as an explanation, totally removed. So they look at the ANC and they look at the ANC corruption and so on. And maybe sometimes they talk about, the global commodities markets and the prices of platinum and gold. And they try to look in those things for the reason. And sometimes then they go on to France and invite people like Thomas Piketty to come in and explain, say, what is going on? Why are things the case they are? And I think that the problem is we can't see the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is apartheid. We do not live in post-apartheid South Africa. Apartheid doesn't have a post. It doesn't have an after. It is the same event, right? Just because a caterpillar changes into a butterfly does not mean that they are not the same organism. They are the same organism. You have just seen them at different intervals. You've seen them at different phases. So it's like a caterpillar and a butterfly. They are the same organism. But then people talk about them as if they are different. And I'm trying to say to people, no, this is still apartheid. It is just undetectable now. And if you look at a butterfly, you see very little of the caterpillar there, right? The caterpillar generally, if you use, sort of maybe aesthetic standards of human beings, looks ugly, it looks unwieldy. Of course, it can't even fly and so on. A butterfly, is more aesthetically pleasing. It flies, it's, Muhammad Ali says, float like a butterfly. It's more aesthetically pleasing. But they are actually the same creature, literally the same creature that you're just seeing at a different phase of their growth. So I do not think there's such a thing as post-apartheid. There's such a thing as after apartheid. What we simply have is apartheid. And so my work is trying to draw attention to the fact that there's an important explanation, which is apartheid. But then the problem is that we've never actually really defined apartheid itself. We've never sat down to systematically define apartheid from the point of view of those who experience it. So the word apartheid is an Afrikaans word that came from the Dutch Reformed Church and from the Afrikaner intelligentsia, from the Broederbond in the late 1920s, as a euphemism to say, you know, we are the chosen ones, we are apart, right? They actually meant it as a positive word. And so the word does not come from the oppressed. And then it was only later that the word was appropriated by the oppressed, and they started to saying, you know, apartheid is what is going on, it describes our lives. And when the white power structure started to reject apartheid, to say apartheid is dead, not to reject, but to pretend that there was no more apartheid. So in the late 70s, the white intelligentsia and the National Party were saying apartheid is dead. And the Africans were saying, how can you say it's dead, right? What is apartheid? If it's dead, show us the corpse. Where is the body of apartheid? And they couldn't answer this. And the point is that you get elites and commentators and historians telling people what apartheid is. Apartheid is so and so. So for instance, they say apartheid is segregation, it's racial segregation or whatever. When these commentators and politicians actually did not leave apartheid. Most of the liberal white historians, most of the white commentators never carried a dompas, not once. In fact, all of them, no single white person, no white person ever carried a dompas, a passbook. So how do you talk about a passbook? How do you talk about it in a way that shows that you know what you're talking about? You're only talking about it in the third person because you do not have the experience. So what do Africans call apartheid, right? Because when you pose these questions about what the oppressed themselves call it, you find out that they are not bound by the demarcations that say it starts in 1948. Because if you, from the top, as a part of an elite, you're calling apartheid as something that begins in 1948, what about what was going on in 1947? What about what was happening in 1946? You know, Peter Abraham's book, Mind Boy, was published in 1946. Are we saying that is not apartheid that is in Peter Abraham's book? And what are you calling things happening in 1995? The informal settlements, the sheikhs. What are you calling the events of Marikana? Right? Is that not apartheid? So you find out that commentators, public intellectuals, they impose a start date and an end date. And I'm puzzled by this, because how do they know the quotidian experiences of the oppressed to say it starts here and it stops here? But when you impose a calendar date, it allows you to say, move on, it has ended. So it allows the elite to say 1994 apartheid has ended, even if people were still living it, even if people were not really sensing the difference, but you are being told by these learned people that it has finished, it has ended, and now you have to move on. And this introduces a schizophrenia in the country where people are still living apartheid, but they're being told that it has ended. And this is the problem in South Africa today. People are being told that something ended which they are living. And so I want us to properly study apartheid and define it for the first time, to actually properly define it. We've never actually properly defined apartheid because we've never defined apartheid from the point of view of the oppressed themselves. Maybe they also had indigenous words for apartheid, right? We've never really thought about those and putting them at the heart of our theorization about violence and power and so on. So I do think that, you know, we need to have apartheid studies in our schools, in our universities, but that's also because we also need to define apartheid itself systematically. And we need to deploy it as a theoretical framework to help us understand the racial polarization in South Africa today, to understand inequality, to understand poverty, to understand the persistence of oppression. Because I also think that apartheid is not just for the study of all these things in South Africa. It is actually a paradigm that you can use to understand what is going on in the US, in America, in Canada, in Australia, in Brazil, in India, right? You go to New York right now, you've got in Manhattan, you've got the most dollar billionaires in Manhattan. And then, you know, just a few kilometers away, you have the Bronx, right? You have some of the poorest areas in New York there. They are not that far off. So, and yet these things are going on together. They've got what you call, quote unquote, a good neighborliness. Why is it there's no crisis anymore? In the past, Marxist theory would tell us that there's going to be class struggle, there's going to be conflict between the classes. You don't see that, right? They live side by side. Here in South Africa, it's even more stuck. Just across the road, you can have an informal settlement like Imizamoyetu in Cape Town. Just across the road, just a few meters, like 10 meters, 20 meters, you have one of the most affluent suburbs called Hout Bay. Just across the road. There is no class struggle there. There is no class conflict there. They live side by side. You see the same thing with Alexandra and Centon. You see the same things in Brazil, in the favelas in Brazil, in Rocinha favela, in the southern zone of Brazil. They are very close to each other. But there is no crisis. The crisis has gone out of the social relation. So we need to study how is it crisis has gone out of the social relation. How can the poor, people who are so poor, who are living on Skid Row, be living in next to skyscrapers where a lot of money is being made and a lot of wealth is exchanging hands? What is this good neighborliness that is at the heart of social relations today? So for me, my work is an important explanation of why crisis has been taken out of the social relation. And I think the answer lies in properly understanding what apartheid is, because it will show you how this is operating in probably virtually any country in the world. Whether you go, like I say, to Canada, to Australia, to Brazil, to India, to Kenya, to Nigeria, to Belgium, you see how the Roma are treated there. You go to London, you look at the Grenfell Tower fire in London. You can be able to use all these examples to see how crisis has been taken out of the social relation. And I'm arguing is because of a paradigm that we need to understand, which is called apartheid. So for me, apartheid is a global paradigm that you can use to study how crisis is removed from the social relation anywhere you want, in any particular case, whether it's Zimbabwe, whether it's Botswana, and so on and so forth. And so we need apartheid studies, not just in schools in South Africa, but I do think in universities in the West, in universities in the East, and so forth, because it is really key to explaining why you can have these things side by side, because that's what we call inequality. These things now coexist, and they shouldn't coexist. Normally, the poor should be angry that, the rich live so close to them, and the affluence is exhibited in such a spectacular way. But no, we look at that as a source of work. We look at that as an opportunity to work. I can become a garden boy. I can become a domestic worker. So actually, I can feed my family, send my children to school, because there's a rich suburb there. So we don't see the contradiction. We see an opportunity for work. This is how rates of oppression are built into our social dynamics. And so my work is trying to get this, because I get this understood, because I think it's really key to understanding why South Africa is imploding now, to understanding why America has the problems it has, right? We frame them as racial problems. They're not just racial problems. They are apartheid problems. Why we have the problems we have in India, with poverty, with caste, and so on and so forth. We read them in the ways we have been used to read them. But I do think that my new way of defining apartheid, my framework of apartheid studies, I think provides a more plausible and authentic and elegant way of explaining why the world is the way it is today. And so this is what I'm trying to test in my work. And I hope my book, Apartheid Studies, a Manifesto, lays out this theoretical framework and can be tested from a variety of disciplines, from historians, from legal scholars, sociologists, social workers, even from physics, because many of the definitions I use to discuss apartheid, like entropy, like the black body, are drawn from physics, from the natural sciences. So my work is an invitation for interdisciplinarity, is an invitation to scholars from a variety of disciplines to actually test the theoretical framework of apartheid studies. I'm not saying apartheid studies is perfect. No, it is not. It just needs to be tested to see if it works. Where it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Maybe it needs to be modified. Maybe it needs to be rejected. But I do believe that it offers an important entry point to actually understanding our modern times, Anotida.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Nyasha. Viewers and listeners, this was Professor Nyasha Mboti. He is an associate professor in the Department of Communication Science. He's also the head of that department at the University of Free State in Bloemfontein in South Africa. His new book, Apartheid Studies, a Manifesto. was published by Africa World Press, and a copy of it can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste right in the description panel on the upload for this video. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and do not miss a single episode. Professor Nyasha, thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you very much, Anotida. It was a pleasure to be on your show. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
That is wonderful. Have a good day.
Thank you. Cheers.